This week I'm going to make a pile of compost. I love making compost, but more than that, I think it's like the cornerstone of gardening. When you've got compost right, everything in the garden just works. Making compost is actually really easy. You just get a load of organic matter, leave it in a pile, eventually it will rot down. The thing is with gardening is you want a lot of it, and so the quicker you can make it, the better. And I've got a really good method, I think, of getting really good compost quickly. But before we get onto that, I'll just show you the difference that compost makes. So we were just standing next to sweet corn that we've been eating for the past week that's head high, tastes great, and this was planted at a similar time, it's had a similar amount of water, and it's about knee high, and we're not going to get anything off these. And the only difference I can think of is the quality of compost that's on the ground. This is my next example. Look at the size of this thing. This is a tamarillo tree. It's only been growing for a few months in a small bucket of compost that I made. And it's just so healthy and it's doing so well. So this is that same variety. This is a tamarillo tree. This has actually been in the ground longer. I planted it about a year ago, and I planted several of them, and I just wasn't getting any success. All of them I just planted straight into the soil, and then I mulched them, so they haven't had compost. I mean, this isn't a scientific study. I mean, the other plant could have had more water and all the rest of it, and it might have had different levels of sunlight potentially, but it's clear that it's the compost that's causing most of the great growth that I'm getting off the other tree. So this is the finished product, black gold. You can see it here. There's a lot of bugs kind of like scrambling around in there, probably still breaking down those final little bits of wood that haven't broken down. There's some worms that are starting to come up, and they'll be kind of helping the decomposition process along, but this is good to go. This is ready to put on a garden. I'll give you a kind of look at it, and you can see there how that looks. It's looking pretty nice. Like I said, there's a few bits of sort of undecomposed wood, but that's fine. That will all kind of slowly break down, but that is going to do a great job of feeding the soil. So this is my 3-bay composting system. It's pretty simple. There's just 3 1-meter cubes. I fill up the outside one first, so I'll go with that one, then I'll fill up this one, and then when they're both full and they've kind of shrunk down, I then combine them into that middle one, and I'll eventually use that compost. And that process of combining them, when you're basically mixing and you're aerating, that speeds along the composting process. And the more that you do that, the faster things are going to compost. But I find that there's a sort of a diminishing return there. So realistically, most of the time, I just do it once. The compost bin behind me is completely empty, so I thought now would be a good time to show you how I build an entire pile from scratch. There's basically 4 main ingredients. So you've got air, water, green material, and brown material. So a lot of composting is just getting those 4 ingredients in the right balance. And that will depend a little bit on where you live. So you might find that you live somewhere really dry and the compost is always drying out, so you might need to water it. Or if you live somewhere wet and it rains a lot and it's damp, then you might need to put a cover on the roof to stop it getting too damp. The way to test this out is you want to grab a handful of compost and squeeze it. And if water drips out, it's way too damp. If you get maybe just 1 drop of water that comes out, then that's perfect. So these are my greens. This is coffee grounds that I get from the local coffee shop. I've also got some horse manure here. So any animal manure would count as a green. You could also use grass clippings. You could use all of the scraps from the kitchen. And all of these green materials supply nitrogen to the compost heap. The difficult stuff to find for me are browns. I never have enough of it. Brown material adds carbon to the compost heap, so you've got nitrogen from the greens, carbons from the browns. But the thing with browns is that they play another role, which is to allow more air into the mixture. So if you were to just have a pile of greens, let's say lawn clippings, and you made up a huge pile, there is the possibility that with all that liquid in there, the air won't get in, and then you get anaerobic composting, i.e. all of that sort of wet, damp material can go all sort of slimy and a bit smelly, and I guess it's breaking down, but it's not composting. So in order to remedy that, you want to add in some brown material. This is an example of brown material. This is just sort of very fibrous, dry matter. You could use leaves, you could use wood chips, you could use cardboard. If you had sawdust, That would be another really good brown to use. You could also use hay or straw. Part of the issue with taking stuff off farms is you don't really know what pesticides they've been using, and in some cases there are these kind of forever chemicals, things like that you probably don't want in your garden. But if you know someone, you can just ask them, hey, does this have pesticides? And then you've got all of the brown material you could ever want. You know, it's funny, you often hear people talk about the microbiome of the gut and how that helps human health. And more recently, people have talked about the production of serotonin inside the gut. So we know that human happiness, potentially, and human health are affected by the gut. But people don't talk about the microbiome of the soil that much. Is there a possibility that the microbiology of the soil and the microbiology inside our gut, could those two things be connected? I mean, it's not that weird to think it, is it? I mean, if you pulled a carrot out of the ground and it still has some of the microbes on it that are inside your soil, and then you eat it, they end up in your gut. Could that affect you? What about the plants as a sort of a transfer mechanism? Could they be taking on the microbiology that's inside the soil and then passing it on to you, to your gut, to your well-being, to your happiness even? I don't know. I mean, this is probably a bit of a stretch for me. It's not like I'm a scientist or anything, but certainly food for thought. This is another good source of browns, just a load of trees that I chopped down the other day. With something like this, I find that I can't just sort of dump all that on the compost. There's just way too much space and air, and so that it doesn't really kind of help the situation. And I don't have a wood chipper, so and I don't want to get one either. I can't be bothered with that. So I just leave this kind of stuff in piles and let it just kind of break down over time, and then I'll come back to it maybe 6 months later or a year later once it's actually rotted down a bit, and then fork this lot up and put it in the wheelbarrow. Right, let's start building this pile. So the first thing I use is a bit of cardboard, and I just lay this around the edges of the pile, and I find that sort of insulates it a little bit, and it helps to build up some heat in there, which you want, so you can break things down a bit faster. I'm using just normal brown cardboard. I always get stuff, if it's got black print on it, that's fine, but any coloured print I don't want, just because there's sort of chemicals in that, and the black print is just vegetable dye, so I don't mind that. I'm just getting rid of some of the sellotapes. I don't want that in there. This is something I get loads of. They're pine needles. We've got a load of pine trees down there. Every time the wind blows, we get a load of it. It's not the perfect thing for composting, mainly because each one of these needles has got kind of waxy coating, so they take a little bit longer to break down. But you know, that's the deal with composting. You just got to work with what you've got at the end of the day. I find the best way to deal with this is that I leave them, either I use them as a mulch, or I'll just leave them in a pile, and then after a year or so, some of this waxy stuff has broken down, and then I compost them, and they work pretty well. Right, I've got all the materials, now I'm going to build the compost pile. I've made loads of compost piles where I just kind of bung everything in, and what I notice is when I go to turn that compost pile, there are some pockets of like really well composted stuff, and there are other bits that nothing really has happened. And so to avoid that, I'm going to do it properly this time and actually layer it. So I'm going to layer greens and browns on top of each other and kind of spread them out so I make them roughly even. Right, so we've got our first layer of coffee down, and I'm building up the second layer with this brown woody stuff. This is another good brown that you might be able to access easily. This is just some grass that I've let dry out in the sun. So this is it's almost like hay. So that will do it as another layer. I'm just smashing this up a little bit because obviously the more surface area, the better, as there's just more space for the microbes to start breaking this stuff down. For my next layer of greens, I'm going to use this, which is horse manure. I got this for nothing, and sometimes they sell it at the side of the road for just a few bucks a bag. The only reason they charge anything is just the time it takes, you know, for someone to actually shovel it up and put it in bags. So if you want free horse manure, all you need to do is look out for somewhere with the stables. These are a load of hedge trimmings, a lot of twiggy stuff, predominantly brown. So they're the next layer. This is some of that sweet corn that you saw at the start of the video. Anything that you get out of the garden like this that's slightly sort of fibrous and woody, like the stems and the stalks, that counts as a brown. So that's going on next. All right, time for another layer of green. I should probably vary it up, and ideally I'd have something like grass clippings. I don't have that at the moment, so I'm just going to go more coffee, which is probably coffee overkill, but that's what I've got, so that's what I'm using. This is something that I just happen to have lying around, just some brown paper. It's not the greatest nutritionally, I doubt, but it does come from trees, is carbon, is going to create a bit of space for the air to get in, so I'm going to put it in. Right, we're starting to fill up now. I'll put the door on for the rest of it, but for now, this is another bag of horse manure, and I'm going to put that on top of all that brown stuff down there. In terms of construction, this is amazingly simple. These are just pallets, and they're not even screwed together. I just put bits of wire on them, and that way you can just take the wire off and take the front off when you want to get at your compost. That pile's getting pretty full now, but it will gradually kind of compress down over time, and I'll add more to it, grass clippings and so on. It does need some water. Normally I wouldn't water it because there's already enough liquid in things like grass clippings or vegetable peelings. All of that sort of stuff has quite a lot of liquid in it. This being quite dry, especially with the coffee, I think I'll add some water. So that's the kind of thing that you just have to work out for yourself based on what you're putting in the compost and the time of year it is. In terms of the amount of air that's coming into your heap, again, that's something that you need to work out. When I first did this, I just used pallets. I found the wind was getting in, it was drying everything out. And so for me, using this cardboard around the edge or using the metal around the back of that compost bin has really helped. But you know, that's the sort of thing that you just need to experiment with for your own climate and see what works. Let me know what you're doing with composting. Are you doing it in one of the kind of plastic Dalek things, a spinny thing, or something like this? I'd be interested to know what you're up to. And also, if any of you out there have any kind of knowledge on that kind of connection between the microbiome, if there is one in the microbiome of the soil and the microbiome of the gut. It's something I don't know much about, but I think it's interesting. Put it down in the comments. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I will see you next week.